All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Probably the one that we have most been waiting for, mid-surfacing, and how similar or different it is between the two versions. Also request to go a little bigger on these. That makes a lot of sense. Thing about engineers, always making sense. Geometry, go ahead and bring some geometry in here real quick. I'm gonna use a part that's been kind of going around, making uh, the rounds here. Go ahead and import this. And pretty traditional, we'll call it stiffened panel type model, right, for aerospace. Something that we would traditionally mid-surface, mesh, and then try to map thickness on, okay? So I'll do this in the classic interface to some extent, and then I'll come to the new one, okay? Okay, so if you want, right, you have the option now to defeature some of these fillets, the rounds, the holes. If you didn't want those, you have the option to do the defeaturing before the mid-surfacing. Honestly, the mid-surfacing has been good enough for quite a while that we can leave a lot of these features in and deal with them on the resultant mid-surface. So I'm not super duper concerned with defeaturing here, but if you wanted to, you certainly can. That is going to be one of the differences between the two versions, is that the geometry engine for defeaturing in the new version is a much more updated geometry kernel. So if that means anything to you, well then good for you. But normally we're going to go through geometry, create mid-surfaces auto, right? We'll see that it's a closed geometry, so I don't have to do any pre-cleanup. I can select a single surface, it grabs the whole part, and all of the extraction options are down here in the panel, right? So offset planes and sweeps is going to be our initial one. If you ever like to select a base surface, you certainly can. But I'm just going to go auto extraction and leave all the defaults because that's what I'll do in the new version as well. And the algorithm behind these two versions is the same. So I would expect whatever I get in this older interface to be basically, well, exactly the same as what I get in the newer interface. Okay. After you do auto mid-surface, you do have a few options, and I only point this out. I usually don't do this at this point, but there's these final edit tools in which you can imprint, say, a surface. So if I wanted this, kind of these fillets, very traditional to have the fillets kind of projected. So I could select the surface and say, well, imprint this surface down to the base. It does some auto detect. There's some options here, etc., etc. And what we should see is that that surface should imprint onto its base here. But we're not seeing that. Maybe we need to pick the target. Oops. Right click to deselect. Instead of auto detect, maybe I have to go in and actually grab the surface, imprint. All right. Well, I'm going to show you how to do that in the new interface, but it should be possible here as well. And I'm going to go ahead and hit return and review my mid-surface, right? So I will hide the solid, look at this, and change the color to by 2D topology. Okay. After you create your mid-surface, it's very common to go and check it, to edit it, and probably 95% of issues can be done via the quick edit, right? I believe this was discussed earlier, how the quick edit panel doesn't really exist anymore. Okay, but there are some, some options within quick edit that could be helpful here. Things like point replace and point retain. So I could say, let me move this point to that point. Okay, and then maybe a little toggle here to get these edges connected, right? There's also probably some options under geometry edit, surface edges, replace, right? So there's a little joggle over here that we can determine, which moved edge and which retained edge and all sorts of things. And then there's this little issue back here where these surfaces didn't seem to get fully split. So maybe a simple type of equivalence. Sometimes this will fix self-intersections, or you'd have to come and do some more trimming and extending. Okay, so we would have to do the geometry cleanup here. We would then go and mesh, which we're not going to spend too much time on. The 2D auto mesh today, we'll just pick a nice little element size. It's a pretty small model, so 0.01. All of these surfaces, hit mesh, turn. And then the final step in this whole process, right, if we're trying to get through a mid-mesh, mid-surface process, would then be to go mesh and then assign, mid-mesh thickness, right? And then we have this very fun tool which says, well, select your solid and then select the elements. And there's options for interval ranges and things like that. But we would come here and select our solid. Beep. We would select our elements that underline the solid. Boop. And we would hit calculate thickness. And it would go through and it's going to measure and do this. So 8 properties. And then when we close out of this tool, excuse me, we can turn on, the coloring by property now. We can also turn on the 2D thickness and review. Okay. Again, very coarse mesh, but that's kind of the process. Okay. This was also encapsulated, this whole thing that I just did, and I point this out because I do, is under this create mid-surface mesh tool under the mesh, which looked like this. And this was a kind of a one-stop shop for those kind of 3 options that I just did: the creating the mid-surface, the meshing, and then the thickness assignment, right? So in this single tool, you could do essentially all 3 of these things with just basically giving it the geometry and setting up everything. This tool doesn't exist in the new interface. Oh, okay. So let's go ahead and move over there. I'll probably just minimize this, or at least make it really, really small. We'll just minimize it. Okay. So let's go ahead and bring the same model over here. I'm going to drag and drop it. Bring in this geometry. Okay. And first thing that I talked about, if you want to defeature, you certainly can. The defeature options are here. You can go fillets, you can go find. It'll search for the fillets in the model, and you can remove them if you'd like. You can also do the same thing with holes, right? So how it classifies a hole, it could also be kind of like a big gap, but you could go in and individually select the holes or deselect these. Okay. I'm not going to do that right now. Just be aware that that exists. I'm going to go and create a mid-surface. So there's the mid-surface tool. It takes me to automatic. It's basically asking me the same questions, right? Select a solid or some bound surfaces. You could even pick 2 pair surfaces if you didn't have a full solid. And then all of the options are in here. So all of those options that were in the panel are still here. They're just in a different spot, right? So I'm going to keep most of this stuff default, except for the fact that I don't particularly like that it masks the input geometry. So after it makes a mid-surface, it hides the geometry. Not a huge fan of that. And I'm also always been a big fan of putting the mid-surface in its own component, especially if you're doing multiple parts. Okay, so I usually just uncheck those 2 things, and I'll hit mid-surface. Once again, the mid-surface algorithm is the same. I don't expect this mid-surface to look different, better, worse. It should just be literally the same. Okay. And I'm as we go here, I'll go ahead and escape from that tool. I will change my selection to solid. This was the option that you could have had there by default, but I like to do this myself. So I'll just hide that solid real quick. And I can go and put myself into the 2D topology view, or the topology view. If I'd like, I can change this from automatic, but I know I have to do some stitching. Okay? So as soon as I enter stitch, I'm going to go ahead and be able to fix a lot of these problems. Remember, Stitch is this kind of one-stop shop. I believe we've talked about it. This does a lot of what Quick Edit panel did. Right? So this does the point replace. This does the edge replace. Grab this edge, drag it to that edge. This does this idea of equivalency, right? So it'll take self-intersections. It does this idea of, you know, of all these things, right? So the stitch tool is quite profound in what it can do. Usually just suggest you go here all the time. Okay, so let me actually clean up this geometry because I said, so I'm just going to stitch these surfaces together. And then there is this little random little lip at the back. We don't need it. I'll just select it and hit delete. Cool. And then these, I think, need to be stitched. So that's a T. Okay. Wonderful. Looks great. Cleaning up the geometry, I think, is quite nice. One thing that I will like to point out as well, that I think is quite unique in this is, let me go and bring the solid back and make this a little transparent. Okay. So this was a fairly straightforward mid-surface, right? So something that happens sometimes is that our mid-surface isn't always perfect. I mean, generally not. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this little flange of the mid-surface here, right? So you see that's the surface internal to this solid. I'm just going to select it and delete it. Okay. So it's essentially as if that surface was missing. Okay. And there's this idea that when we mid-surface, I really want to get, like, if the computer can do 95% of the work for me, I'm okay with doing maybe 5% of the work to get this mid-surface the exact way that I want it, right? And so, I use this as an example to say this is not a failure of the I mean, sure, it's a failure of the mid-surface, but it's a failure in as much as, like, we're all failures. But this one little issue here is not enough to say this whole thing is garbage and throw it away. But what we do have now is we have much newer and better tools for fixing this, right? So in the old interface, we would probably have had to do some sort of like patch or some sort of ruled surface here, and then it would have been a big square, and we would have had to equivalence it in. We would have had to trim it with the solid, right? So there would likely be a square that's poking out with a big triangle here. And it would just take a while. Okay, but I just quickly show this because I think it's quite powerful in what it can do. Is that the surface has this option to patch, right, or extend. You can do either one here. The extend will allow you to obviously select an edge and extend it, but I'm pointing out this little option here in the pop-up micro that says auto trim intersecting surfaces. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to take, turn that on, it allows you to take a edge and drag it to create a surface, but when you release, it's going to trim with intersecting surfaces, right? So even though I pulled it farther than the extent of the solid, it trimmed with the surfaces that were intersecting it, and you can see the topology has been updated as I escape this tool, and now I have that surface. Okay. So, the mid-surfacing algorithm hasn't gotten any better. However, the tools to deal with what comes out of the mid-surfacing have gotten much, much better. Okay. And just a few other things I think I mentioned in the other one, wasn't very successful, is this idea of the pocket imprint. So this is probably quite common. Once again, where you can pick either lines or surfaces, take these and then imprint them onto your underlying surface, so you get a nice smooth transition here. And you can select multiple, you would select multiple of these little cutouts and imprint them. So you get a nice smooth transition when we mesh this. Okay, let me go ahead and turn back our transparency to full and hide my solid again. I think I'm done with use solid for a little bit. Right click and hide. Okay, and there you can see my little pockets there. Right, that just gives you a much smoother transition. So that was under the pocket imprint. So last couple of things that I do like to talk about. I believe I pointed this out last time, but if you want washers around these holes, that's certainly something you can do as well. That would be under the split option and split with lines. And unfortunately, it's a little hidden. I think this is kind of hard to get to, and we'll probably fix this. But what we really want to do is we want to do offset lines and a washer split, right? So kind of lots of clicks to get here. But at the end of the day, you'll be able to select an edge, and we'll say, well, how many washers do you want and what distance do you want them at? But we also have a really cool option that I don't know if I've ever shown before, but we have the ability to select similar. Okay? And similar is very kind of subjective, but in this case, what similar is going to look for is it's going to look for with similar edge length and type. So free edges that are about whatever the length of that arc is. You know, is it pi over 2 or something? I don't know how big the radius is, but I can select all of these. I can say, yes, I want that. And then the new trim line, I think, if our mesh size was 0.1 or 0.01, I don't remember what it was, but I'll just put something small in here. Oh, that's way too big. We want 0.005 maybe. There we go. So I can get a bunch of little washers around those holes, okay? And by using the select similar, I think that's kind of cool. That's a cool little option. Okay, so continuing on our process, right? Again, we'll talk about meshing a little more next week, but for now, let me just go ahead and mesh this part. 0.05, so 0.01. So I want a little finer mesh on this one than my last one. And oh, that's very fine. Undo, Control Z. 0.005. All right, that'll be fine. Whatever. Okay, much better. Again, we'll talk about the 2D meshing next week, but I have a mesh on this part. And then finally, kind of to sum it all up, right, what is the final step in this mid-surface workflow is the ability to map thickness from the solid to the underlying elements, right? So this map thickness, it says identify your source geometry, pick your solid, pick the elements that, once again, underlie this, and hit apply thickness, and all of your options are going to be in here, right? So all those options for, what range of thickness do you have? All the options that we had in the other one are going to be in here. And then by default, we put you in a color mode. Let me a color mode that is colored by element thickness and also turns on the 2D rep, right? So those few clicks I had to do previously in the old interface, that does it for you here within this tool after you're done. So again, few clicks there, few clicks here. Don't count clicks. It's not that important. Okay. And then wonderful. Okay. So like I said, I don't have that singular mid-mesh tool, but what I do have is I have the ability to create a custom toolbar, right? So I have a few here. I'll just make another one. Right click, create new custom page. Okay. And from this custom page, I can go ahead and take all of these discrete separate tools that I used in my mid-surface, workflow, and just drag and drop them in there. So I use mid-surfaces. Split is always important. You should always put split and stitch in there. Maybe you use the surface tool as well. Boop. We use general 2D mesh. We'll talk about meshing next week. And then finally, we use this map thickness tool. Boop. And I put all those in here. Okay. So now I have a single one-stop shop for, right-click, rename, Midsurf. Oh, yeah. Something like that. And all the tools that I need are right here. Okay, so I know it's not a single one-click, but this is kind of the workflow that we have right now. So with that, put a little ribbon on this and hand it off. So once again, I appreciate your time. Next week, we're talking 2D meshing. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And thanks a lot.